The average household in America, if you cleanly electrified all of those machines, would save $1,800 a year on their energy bills. That's a lot of money in a country where 49% of Americans don't have $400 in emergency savings at all, let alone an additional $1,800 a year check into their pockets.
The climate conversation has never been more divided. As disruptors in this space, we're hungry to find solutions to the challenges our environment faces. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar. I'm joined by Owen Barrett and Chris Pomerleau. We are experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. We celebrate those who take action against the climate crisis and are striving to make the world a cleaner place. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. Joining me as always is the self-proclaimed Adam Newman of Green Building, Owen Barrett. Unfortunately today, the real estate oracle of Omaha, Chris Pomerleau, couldn't join. But of course, my name's Joel Caesar, the world's greatest climate podcast host. Today's guest was Ari Matusiak. He's the CEO and co-founder of Rewiring America, the leading organization focused on electrifying everything in our homes, businesses, and communities. He's also the co-founder of Purpose Venture Group, a boutique social impact advisory and incubator building ventures to address climate and economic inequality. Well, Owen, you know, electrification is an important topic of mine. I spend a lot of time working on it in my day job. No one better than Ari to break it down to why it's important, why it matters, why it's better. I learned a ton, as I always do when I hear Ari, but I think the takeaway for me was how he just really consistently keeps coming back to the message of this is better for people, this is better for families, this is better for health, this is better for their long-term economic decisions. And I think it's a good reminder. You know, we can talk all about climate and some people care, some people don't, but if we can convince people to do things because it's better for their house and their family and their economic futures, then I think we'll have a better route to winning this for.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously he's a wealth of knowledge with electrification, but I liked his advice to basically pitch climate change of a story of abundance, kind of like a micro abundance on household levels, and using that to depoliticize the entire topic. You know, whether or not that works, I think we'll see. But it's a great strategy.
No doubt. But before we get to that, we want to play our first bit using artificial intelligence. So today we are going to use Bard, Google's AI chatbot, and we're going to ask it some rebellious questions about clean energy, net zero real estate, whether or not Owen Barrett is a smart person. So, Owen, you ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
Well, I'm going to tee us up. If you haven't heard of Bard, it's Google's competitor version of generative artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, which you might have heard of. But we wanted to try Bard. We're going to focus it on net zero real estate. So I asked it a question, is it profitable to operate net zero real estate? And it gave me some non-answer about sometimes, depends, but it had a good tidbit to say the upfront costs of operating net zero real estate may be higher, but those costs are coming down. And the operational cost of running buildings on traditional energy is increasing. So it's alluding to that while it can't give us a straight answer, there's a lot of reasons to believe it's the right thing to do and it's what's going to be better in the future. Then I asked it, do you know how I can invest in net zero real estate? And it gave me another answer I didn't love, is about you can maybe invest in a net zero building if you can find a way to invest in that. There's REITs, which you and I both know. We don't think there's any REITs that are focusing on net zero. And then it said ESG, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast, whether or not we think if you invest in ESG, you're actually doing anything for net zero. So then I asked it, have you heard of the company Raven, where individuals can invest in net zero real estate? And this is where it gets cool. It says, yes, I have heard of Raven. It is a company that provides a platform for individuals to invest in net zero real estate. It's founded in 2019 by a team of experienced real estate and sustainability professionals. So we love that. And actually, we might have to be borrowing some marketing material from Bard here. But then it actually has some inaccuracies. Raven's platform allows individuals to invest. And then it says, our projects are certified by the International Living Future Institute. So
that's interesting. It must have pulled up. I think it goes through YouTube transcripts. So I wonder if it got confused by one of the podcasts that we had. It's now putting those two together.
We talked to Lindsay about maybe using the Living Future Institute to certify. But then it says here real quick, and then I'll let you go. It gives us pros and cons of Raven. And it says, you know, the pros, minimum investment is a pro. It's easy access. It's only $250. Diversified portfolio of real estate. Company with strong track record. Cons, relatively new. Of course, we'll acknowledge that. Raven's a new company. Investments are illiquid. We'll also acknowledge it's true of real estate investment. And investments are risky, as investment in real estate can be considered risky. So all in all, I'll give Bard a thumbs up on that last answer about Raven.
Man, it's interesting. I've been wearing the same shirt this entire year, and I'm going to continue it for the entire year. It says, get paid to fight climate change. It's meant to be a conversation starter, ideally for people who are interested in fighting climate change. Yesterday, I wore it to the climbing gym and was accosted by a science denier, which was,
nice.
Whole story in itself. But he was trying to convince me climate change isn't real. The science is not there. All this stuff I always hear. So I wanted to hear Bard's perspective. Is climate change real? It gives a ton of information, but right at the top, yes, climate change is real. And then a couple sentences after that, the overwhelming consensus among climate scientists is that the warming is caused by human activities, primarily the burning of fossil fuels. So, there's a lot of crazy stuff on the internet. And I was glad to see that Bard has deciphered the crazy from the truth and is on our side with this one. And then one more thing that I asked, in honor of Chris not being able to join.
Oh, I said Chris one too. Go ahead.
Who is Chris Pomerleau? Well, so it said, I do not have enough information about that person to help with your request. So then I said, who is Chris Pomerleau from Omaha? Again, it said, I do not have enough information about that person to help with your request. So Chris has to work on his own SEO. I was hoping it would, give me a spiel about his background.
I'm wondering if you have a different version of Bard. I said, does Chris Pomerleau know anything about real estate? He said, yes, Chris Pomerleau knows a lot about real estate. He has been involved in the real estate industry for over 15 years and has a wealth of experience. He is also co-founder of Raven, a company that provides a platform for individuals to invest in net zero real estate. He says, real estate syndicator, where he manages $211 million in assets under management. He's an attorney at Nebraska Legal Group. He's a logistics officer in the U.S. Army.
Oh, it's got everything on him.
So then, one last follow-up. Then I said, is Chris Pomerleau a good-looking man? I was going to try to make up something to make fun of him here, but I don't want to be giving misinformation about Bard. It says, I do not have enough information about that person to help with your request. I am a large language model, and I am unable to communicate and generate human-like text in response. Okay.
I think, down the road, I think it's going to be able to objectively say whether you're attractive or not.
And we know the answer to that for Chris Pomerleau will be no. Oh, this is great. We got to do more segments when he's not here so we can just take shots at him. It's a fun segment with Bard. I think it's something we'll continue revisiting as we both learn how to use it better. And seems like at least my version, we got some tidbits that we should be using in our marketing campaign. Well, that was fun. Thank you, Google, Bard. Now, enjoy our conversation with Ari Matusiak. Ari Matusiak is a distinguished leader and social entrepreneur leading the charge in promoting home electrification, confronting climate change, and tackling economic inequality. I met Ari recently through my work at Google leading the electrification program there. Ari was recommended to me as basically being Mr. Electrification right now across America on a very important, popular topic. So we're excited to dive in. Ari, welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. We like to get right to work here on the show. We start every guest with the same question. How are you a climate rebel?
Well, trying to electrify 1 billion machines across 121 million households. So I think that's a pretty rebellious act for the climate.
Well, we totally agree. So let's dive right into that. I'm sure you'll tell us here about the organization you're most intently representing right now, but I know you have a number of hats you wear, but maybe we can start with your role at Rewiring America, and you can tell us a little bit about what it is.
Sure. So Rewiring, I'm the co-founder, CEO of Rewiring America. We are an organization committed to electrifying everything in the economy that can be electrified, and really focused on the machines that we rely on in our day-to-day lives, where we live, where we work, where we spend our time. And so to kind of give the orienting numbers around that, if you think about energy emissions in this country, 42% of energy-related emissions actually come from decisions people make around their kitchen tables. What kind of cars they drive, how they heat the air and water in their homes, how they cook their food, how they dry their clothes, and where the power comes from all those things. So the billion machines that I mentioned actually represent those kitchen table decisions across 121 million households in the United States. And that's 42% of our energy-related emissions, which creates kind of like a but-for climate. Unless we go and decarbonize and electrify those machines, there's no way that we're going to meet our climate targets. Not even close, actually, because there's just too much by way of emissions that's tied up in machines that we rely on just to live our lives. And that's a really important orientation point because it connects to a couple of other numbers. The average household in America, if you cleanly electrified all of those machines, would save $1,800 a year on their energy bills. That's a lot of money in a country where 49% of Americans don't have $400 in emergency savings at all, let alone an additional $1,800 a year check into their pockets. The work that is tied to electrifying those machines is work that can't be automated or offshored or AI'd. And so those are local jobs that put money back into the economy and reinvest in communities. So that's all positive. But it also ties to another idea, which is a little bit at the core of why we started Rewiring, which is that if you take a poll in America and ask people about whether they're concerned about the climate, a pretty consistent number that you will get is 70%. 7 out of 10 Americans are effectively concerned about climate. But if you then ask them what they should do about it, the number one thing people say is to recycle. And the number two thing people say is to stop eating meat. And the disconnect between frankly, the power that we have to shift the trajectory of our climate based on decisions that we make around our kitchen tables and the awareness about that and the agency and capability to go after that is really why we started Rewiring, to make it easier for households to get better things that improve their lives while also addressing the climate crisis.
Ari, can I jump in and ask a couple questions?
Yeah.
One, I think you do our elevator pitch for Raven better than we do, so we need to take some notes there. Remember some of those numbers. But I think, on this podcast, we have kind of a wide range of audience. Some people are like the three of us, I would say self-proclaimed sustainability nerds and really understand sort of the nuances of all this. But I think for the people that maybe are looking for a little bit more kind of entry-level info.
Yeah.
Why is it even important that we electrify our houses? Maybe I'll pause there because a lot of the chatter that we get on our social media is, EVs don't matter. You're charging it with dirty energy. I think Joel and I know the answer to this, but I'd love to hear your response to that, to people to sort of understand the bigger picture in all this.
Yeah, and he said cleanly electrified, so maybe that's why. But go ahead, Ari.
Yeah, it's a really good and important question. And actually, this morning, I went to my 8-year-old's classroom to read a book to her class, and I was introduced as the dad who wants to electrify everything, which was sort of hilarious. But I was reading a book about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But anyway, it had nothing to do with electrifying anything. But the question that I got from one of the kids was about why electrify. So pretty much the same as what you just asked, Owen. And then I got a follow-up question, which was, but, if we're trying to tackle the climate change, that's good, but then sometimes we have to give up things that are also good. And the example used was by this 8-year-old was air conditioning. Kids will point their way to the truth very quickly. And I think there's something really insightful about like joining up your question with that insight from that 8-year-old, which is that in the end, if you just think about it logically, emissions are caused by greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are effectively caused by lighting fossil fuels on fire. And the longer we go doing that, the longer we're going to perpetuate having greenhouse gases. It's pretty simple. So long as we have really machines in our homes or in our driveways or in our garages that rely on fossil fuels, or the way I think about it, that have pipes instead of plugs, then you are not able to actually stop burning fossil fuels, right? So if you have a machine in your house that relies on natural gas, that's got to come from somewhere, and you're tying into an infrastructure that we're basically reinvesting in to deliver the gas to that machine so that you can have your temperature at whatever number it is in your house. So as long as we have that system architecture where you have pipes that are delivering fossil fuels that we are then igniting in order to live our lives, we don't actually stop the cycle of emitting greenhouse gases. So the answer to that ultimately has to be about moving off of those things. And how do you move off of those things? Well, the best way to do that, it turns out, is by electrifying those machines and having them have plugs and not pipes. And the good news about that transition is that the machines that you are moving to are better machines. You know, the electric car is a better car than a fossil fuel car. And I say this as someone who's been a car nut since I was 8. And I've had a car magazine subscription since I was 8 years old. But electric cars are just better cars than every car I loved as a kid. And this is true for every other sort of example in the set of machines that we're talking about. So you're not actually asking someone, and this was my answer to this 8-year-old, we're actually not asking anyone to give anything up or to have something that's less. It's actually about transitioning to better things and enabling Americans to get access to better stuff, which is itself pretty American, and making that transition easier. And I think, Joel, you asked the question about, well, EVs rely on a dirty grid, or they rely on the supply of that energy is itself not clean. And we don't have a 100% renewable or clean source of energy in this country or source of electricity. However, all of the new capacity and generation that we're building in this country is almost entirely renewable and clean, because it turns out it's cheaper to build that. So actually, the best way to support the transition of the grid to clean electricity generation is by having more demand for electricity, because that makes the investor proposition easier to transition the supply of energy as we uptick the demand for electricity, if that makes sense.
Well, it's such an important point here, and I'd love to try to unpack it a little bit too. I think my day job is building electrification. I've been working on it for 2 years, 800 building global portfolio. I get the question Owen just asked all the time. I also get questions about why not energy efficiency first. I've heard you answer that question before, Ari, but we have to think about this in terms of timelines. I think all of us in climate, all of us who care about solving it, if the grid isn't going to get there, then what are we even trying for? So we all have to make this base assumption. The grid will get there. And then commercial buildings is one thing. Ari, I know you focus a lot on single family homes, but in both scenarios, the type of equipment that we'd love to replace with an electric version lasts a long time for a lot of good reasons. Boilers, stoves, things that if you install one that runs on gas, you probably should keep that for 10, 15 years to get the most out of your investment and all the embodied carbon that comes along with those materials. So the point is, we have to make a bet that the grid is coming. And as you just clearly outlined, there's lots of economic incentivized reasons to assume that will happen. And if you assume that will happen and you're making that bet, then you have to have the machines on the end that are going to be able to run on that clean energy. And you have to swap them at the most opportune time, which is what Rewiring, I know, is trying to do. Tell homeowners around the country, when your gas boiler dies, or you're about to do a renovation, or you're thinking about doing something with your kitchen, we have great incentives to try to encourage you to use the electric version. So I'm sure you'd agree with all those points, Ari, but maybe you can say it a little better than I did.
Yeah, I think you said it really well. And I do agree with all those points. I like thinking about it as a kitchen table decision, just because whether or not it's actually a decision made at the kitchen table, that idea, I think, is very helpful because you make a decision to make a purchase, to transition, to commit to something when it is right for you as a family. This is a really important idea. When a family is thinking about getting a different car, a used car, a new car, when a family is stressed out about whether they're going to need to replace their furnace this winter and how to make that work, those are moments of a commitment that a family is making. And at that moment, having an option available that is actually the better option is what we are trying to accomplish. Because if the value proposition to a family is you can get this water heater, or you can get a heat pump water heater that is going to deliver more consistent and more quickly heated water and save you some money on your energy bills every year, there's no reason why you wouldn't choose this option. Unless you didn't know about it, or didn't know how to get it, or didn't know how to navigate the installation of it, or all those things, which, by the way, are all issues. So I think about it not as, here's a bunch of stuff that you have to go do right now, but as people are coming up on decision points in their lives to be positioned to get the better electric machine. And that's really what we're talking about. And I think on that basis, Joel, as you kind of said, these machines last a long time, 10 years, 12 years, 15, 20 years. The average car on the road today is 14 years old. So if you say, well, I'll miss it this time and I'll get it the next time, from a climate perspective, that's not great, because we really only have a little bit more than one replacement cycle left before all these things need to be purchased new as electric.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, going back to the kitchen table decision, and I don't know if you guys have put together these numbers like high level across the country, but you mentioned that families would save about $1,800 if they were to electrify, and I'm assuming decarbonize. Do you have a high level cost pre and post IRA? Like what that is at the household level?
Yeah, there's the cost and then there's the delta of the cost to what you would have done anyway, right? So if you think about the cost of a heat pump, it's not the cost of a heat pump versus no cost. It's the cost of a heat pump versus a furnace, right? Same, machine by machine. And right now, it's just true that the heat pumps are more expensive than furnaces, that induction stoves are more expensive than, a gas stove. And that's why the Inflation Reduction Act was a really important thing that we worked on, to try to inject rebates and incentives to help push the cost down. So that if you think about it, if you can make the front end math work, then you get the benefit of the over the life, the operating cost savings. But the front end math also has to work for a family, because these are not insignificant expenditures. So you asked the question about how much it costs. The answer, the sort of like not great answer, is it depends, right? It depends on the house. It depends on the size of the system and all the things. But one way to think about it might be that the average cost of a heat pump in the US, to install a heat pump in the US, might be somewhere around $15,000, which is a lot of money. But this is where the rebates start to come into play and to push those costs down. And you start to think about in which case it makes a ton of sense to do this versus might be worth waiting for a bit. The other thing I just want to say about this is that a big part of the theory of the case here is that, and this is not a sort of a novel theory, is that as you make more machines, the cost of making machines comes down, which means the price comes down. And so last year, for the first time in the history of the US, heat pumps outsold gas furnaces. That's a big deal, because that means there's market uptick. And as you get more of that happening, the cost of production of the heat pump comes down. And just like we're seeing with EVs and solar and battery storage, the same is going to be true for every single one of these technologies. So over time, the incentives will become less and less necessary, because the front end cost of the machines will be kind of off the shelf, the same as what they were for, the fossil fuel alternative.
Yeah. Joel, I know we don't want to get too into the weeds of the IRA, but I got one more question that I have to ask. Were the incentives, I'm just curious, were the incentives designed to make the electric machines at parity of sort of the gas counterparts, or were they done to make electric machines more competitive now when you take the rebate into account?
Well, as you know well from your experience in this market, it's hard to create like a one size fits all incentive, right? That is going to work for every use case. So one of the things we tried to do was argue for as robust of an incentive as could make sense to really make the front end cost of these machines competitive with their fossil fuel counterparts. And so in some cases, it's going to work out quite well, because you'll have a stacking of incentives that will make the electric machine just the more compelling option in the market. In some cases, it'll be roughly equivalent. In some cases, it still might be a little bit more expensive, but the idea is to, kind of analogous to what has happened with EVs. It wasn't as though the $7,500 tax credit was going to quote unquote solve the price gap between EVs and internal combustion engine cars, but it helped to jolt the market and move it forward. So not a perfect solution in that sense, but I think it will prove to be catalytic in the market.
Yeah, I agree.
Ari, there's so many things we want to discuss with you, and we know you wear a ton of hats, but I knew this was going to happen. I was worried about myself because I'm just so focused on electrification in a lot of ways. But one more point I want to make sure we clarify here. Hopefully there's a lot of people in our audience who are learning. Like you said here at the beginning, there's a gap between what people should do about the climate, what they think they need to do. So electrification is really important. We need to continue to unpack it. You said better machines. So again, I work on this a lot in my day job. I should be better at articulating what I'm about to say, but it's something about, right, the efficiency of work. In a heat pump, you take a fuel, electricity, and convert that into heat. I believe it's something like 4 times more efficient at doing that process than taking combustion and turning that into heat that's distributed across a house or a floor of a commercial office building. And in EVs, I think it's better, right? It's something like the internal combustion engine is 20% efficient at converting a fuel into work, whereas the electric vehicle, I think, is some multiple higher than that. So is that a decent way of explaining the better machine?
Yeah, well, that's definitely one vector of better, but there are multiple vectors of better. So one vector of better is efficiency. Turns out electric machines are, because you said earlier, like, why don't we focus on efficiency first? Well, electric machines are of energy efficiency as a strategy, right? As you well know, because they're 3 to 4 times.
Wait, while we're here, what's your quote? You said it to me in a different forum. You can't efficiency to zero, right?
Yeah, you can't efficiency your way to zero. That's true. So you have to get off the fossil fuel stuff if you want to get off the fossil fuel stuff. Like that's like kind of like a truism. But electric machines are also just 3 to 4 times more efficient than fossil fuel machines. And a lot of that has to do with waste heat, right? Like just think about like your car. You drive your car around for a while, you park your car, you put your hand on the hood of the car, the hood is hot. And it's hot because of the waste heat that's happening. And that's just energy that's getting lost. You don't have that dynamic when you have electric machines. So they are much more efficient in terms of the taking of energy and turning it into kind of something that is usable to you, which is what you just said, Joel. That's true for cars. It's true for heating your home. It's true for heating the water in your house. It's true for cooking, all the things. But better is not just on that, because like a lot of times people don't buy things because they're more efficient, right? So the car is a great example. When I was growing up, the highest performance cars or cars that could make 300 horsepower and they were, pretty fast. Now you have really high performance cars that can make 600 horsepower or 500 horsepower or whatever the number is. If you actually listen to what car executives, auto manufacturing executives say about the internal combustion engine car, they say that there's no innovation left in this technology. We've done everything we could possibly do to squeeze out the best performance from this technology. And now enter the electric car has just a ton more horsepower, a ton more torque. It is faster. It also has fewer parts. It's better in the sense from a maintenance perspective. It lasts longer. It has better handling because the weight of the battery pushes the car's center of gravity lower to the ground, which makes it easier to go around corners. There's sort of like a lot of reasons why the electric car is better in addition to being more efficient. I think about this, there's like a lot of talk about stoves these days, like an induction stove versus a gas stove. We've been given decades of marketing. Like I interviewed someone who said like, wow, now we're cooking with gas. I'm like, actually, we're going to be cooking with magnets. But the idea, like there's sort of like an idea that you have better temperature control and it's like a better experience to cook with gas. And as compared to coil electric ranges like the one my parents had when I grew up, that's absolutely true. But as compared to an induction stove, it's not. The induction stove is like 3 times faster boiling your water. It is a lot less hot in a kitchen. So if you think about like a commercial kitchen in a restaurant, it's a lot nicer of a place to work if you don't have fire everywhere. And by the way, like I think about this, it's a lot easier to clean something that's smooth than if you have to lift the grates off and scrape the stuff around the burner and whatever. So there's like, those are examples of how these machines are just better. And so you can go on. And I think it's kind of like the difference between like asking the question of, should we watch Netflix or should we watch that on VHS? Like, we should watch it on Netflix, right? Like this is kind of like the stage that we're at in terms of the technology.
On the stove, you didn't even discuss the health impacts, which I know has been getting a lot of attention about some research showing the indoor air quality impacts on human health and child cases in asthma. And
I feel like the annoyance of having to clean a stove that's not flat is more convincing than invisible health effects.
I never really thought about this before, but an induction stove, for your listeners that don't know, it's using magnets and it's transferring energy directly from the magnet in the stove to the pot. So it's not actually heating up the surface of the stove. If you have boiling water in your pot, take the pot off, put your hand on the stove, like that would be normally a very bad idea. But if you do that on an induction stove, you won't burn your hand. The reason why you won't burn your hand is because the surface is not actually the thing that's heating up. It's the transfer of energy from the magnet underneath the surface to the pot itself. So that's really cool technology. That's great. But what I never really thought about is, because that's what's happening, let's say you spill some like cheese on the cooktop. Because the cooktop is not what's actually getting hot, you aren't having to like scrape the burnt stuff off after. It's just whatever fell off of your pan or whatever else. This is an example to me of, when we look back 10 years from now, people will say, yeah, I don't know, like, of course, like, why would I ever want this other thing? Like, this is much better. But people just don't know about it yet, and they haven't had the experience and sort of the reps with the technology. As they do, they're not going to elect, I think, for worse stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Joel, I see a lot of the stuff that I think you have posted about gas stoves in the Google fight to electrify kitchens. You know, it's interesting because I've never thought about it before this podcast either, but I think what's abundantly clear in America is like health doesn't sell. Like, we do a lot of shit that's bad for us. And that doesn't stop people from doing it. But if you tell someone that they don't have to scrub the cheese off their stove after they make whatever, pasta, maybe that's a difference maker.
Tapping into the American culture of being lazy
Convenience.
as opposed to trying to be healthy, which we're not famous for here.
I think we will find that the reasons for doing something are going to be varied, of course. And for some families, that will be really important, right? The health reasons will be really important. It's going to be important for insurance companies. They're going to say, you know what? Actually, this would cost us less money if we had people with induction stoves.
I think you're our 10th guest so far in the Climate Rebels podcast. Oh, and how many times does insurance come up? Probably half of them?
It comes up all the time. And man, I would love to be one of the optimistic believers that insurance companies will figure this out. I'm not. I think I don't think insurance will ever catch up to where humanity is at in terms of what makes sense to either incentivize through like premiums or policies or disincentivize. But yeah, Joel, it comes up on every podcast.
Well, one last question on electrification, Ari, and I'd love to get into your purpose venture work and, of course, some stories from the White House if you can, but this might be a little even provocative to Owen. You've met Owen, you've learned about our business model, what we like to talk about here, our company Raven. We're trying to get the message out and tell people, look, instead of recycling, you want to do something about climate, you can invest in net zero real estate with us. But our business model is very focused on the simplest strategy, we think, to decarbonize existing buildings, which is adding solar. I would guess if we asked you, hey, we buy apartment buildings and we try to make them better for the climate, what should we do first, or what should we focus most on? You might say something different. We buy existing apartment buildings and we want to make them better for the climate. What do you think should be the one thing we focus on?
I think my answer to that would be whatever the first thing is that puts the building on a path to becoming fully electric. So in the billion machines, by the way, we count rooftop solar in that, and we count storage in that. Not for every household, because every household is not going to be a candidate. We think about a third of American households could be, candidates for rooftop solar. More than that, but if you just sort of think about overall like market trends. So good news about rooftop solar as a part of this strategy is that it causes a lot of savings to start working, and it immediately creates a disjuncture between the power source in the home and the machines if they are relying on fossil fuels. As soon as you've put rooftop solar on a building and created a power source for the building that is clean and electric and owned
on site, yeah,
it really doesn't make sense after that to hold on to machines that are using other power, right? You can use the power from those solar systems to convert everything over.
Ari, can I ask a question about kind of your outlook on EVs and how this ties into everything? Because I've heard you, I think it was you on a podcast that said something. The average storage system of a US house, I think, is around 6 kilowatt hours, and the average battery in an EV is 70 kilowatt hours. As EVs go mainstream, do you think that's going to put storage companies out of business if we can make the energy go two-way between cars and houses?
I don't think so. I think there's going to be any number of use cases for why you have backup storage on your house. But I think in a lot of cases, you might say, you know what, the battery in the car is covering what we need as a family. And so we don't need the incremental expense for the storage on the side of the house. I think what it just does is it expands the surface area of options when you start thinking about storage. And that doesn't mean it's a knockout to residential storage technology or, to batteries that might be part of attached to the house. But I think it might mean in certain cases that the car is enough.
Yeah, until I heard you say that, I never really understood how much larger an EV battery is than a standard residential installation.
Yeah.
Let's break from rewiring and electrification for a second, but we'd love to learn a little bit about your time at the White House. Maybe you can describe what your role was in the Obama administration and link that to, I know you were very personally involved in the Inflation Reduction Act advocacy, and your organization, Rewiring America, was pivotal to its passing. So maybe you can help our audience learn, what's it like on the inside, making policy, trying to convince the government to do the right thing, and how these levers are pulled?
Well, I served in President Obama's White House for 4 years. It was, in many ways, the most meaningful and important chapter of my life, not least of which because I met my now wife and started our family while we were at the White House. So it was a magical time. And maybe one thing to say about the White House and just government in general is that a lot of times you hear, quite negative things about Washington and our politics, and rightly so, because our politics are not healthy all the time. There's seemingly like a disconnect between the conversation in Washington and people's day-to-day lives. But for me, one of my biggest takeaways from that experience was that you could do more in a single day for people, for families and communities working in government and kind of oriented to what the levers of government can do than you could do in a whole lifetime outside. And I had the privilege of working quite a lot on the Affordable Care Act, expanding health insurance for people. And the reality is, expanding coverage to 30 million more Americans and making sure that they feel kind of at ease in their healthcare and also able to afford it, that's a seismic thing. And has really powerful implications for the economy, for the overall well-being of our society, for our competitiveness against other countries, like all of these other things. And so for me, my job at the White House was working on economic policy focused on jobs and competitiveness. And I oversaw the relationship between the president and the White House with the private sector, with CEOs and entrepreneurs and investors in Wall Street. And so there was no single issue I worked on. Anything that touched on the economy was inbound. So the days were dynamic and fascinating and hard and always different than you thought they were going to be, when you walked into the office at the beginning of the day. But it taught me quite a lot about the interconnection between kind of how you think about a family's well-being and the overall sort of well-being of our country and our economy and our sort of position in the world. And that is actually a lot of what is at the core of Rewiring America, is this idea that there's a big issue, climate change, that we need to address. We need to address it for existential reasons, and we also need to address it for economic and competitive reasons and all the things. But tie that to people's day-to-day lives. If you really focus on that and making people's day-to-day lives a little bit better, then you can unlock a lot of benefit for the thing that you're working on, i.e. climate change in this case, but do it in a way that's also more durable politically, because if people are seeing the benefits of something, then they're going to say, that's a pretty good idea. Like, we should do more of that. Whereas if it's just sort of lining the pockets of like some elites, or if it's not like in your day-to-day life, you can say like, well, why are we focused on that? That's not important. And so a lot of what we worked on with the Inflation Reduction Act was that idea, was connecting climate to the kitchen table and really everything in the Inflation Reduction Act that touches the kitchen table is what we worked on at Rewiring. And I think politically, it was also a good strategy in terms of like pulling the levers of argument and trying to convince people. It's a lot easier when you're talking about someone's constituents than when you're talking about something that's like kind of abstract and not tangible, if that makes sense.
It makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I know Owen and I, in one of our recent episodes, we spoke to Lindsay Baker, CEO of the Living Future Institute, and we talked a lot about the interconnection of climate and equity. And I think Owen made a great comment about how, as owners of apartment buildings, as our business, as we are, you can't think about anything except that there are people living, their homes are in our buildings. And we can say our rooftops are there to solve climate change, but ultimately we're a business that needs to make communities better. So it's a great point that we all need to understand. Well, it's a good segue to our last question. Ari, I think you already touched on some of this. We try to highlight here on the Climate Rebels podcast, optimism, people taking action, disruption, solutions. And we want to stay away from the noise of negativity and doomsdayers saying the climate's coming for all of us. So maybe you can help us with one last question. What gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope for the future is that I'm just going to tie it back to this classroom of kids that I had the privilege of being with this morning. You know, each generation, I think, is a little bit better than the last one. And when I look at our kids, like what they expect the world to give them is, it's sort of not optional that we take care of the planet, that we take care of people, that we're like sort of building something that's for all walks and types. And when you sort of like peel everything back, there's a common sense to the idea that everyone should be able to participate in the economy and society and sort of do a little bit better. And what gives me hope about climate is that what we are working on anyway, and what I think so many people are working on, are solutions that actually are just tied to making people's lives a little bit better. And that is not a story of sacrifice at all. That's a story of abundance. It's a story of shared prosperity. It's a story of why wouldn't we want to have better stuff? It's a story of just kind of what should be inevitable. And I think that in the end wins out over the nonsense, because as we go forward, machine by machine, household by household, you're going to have people who are now experienced in what could be, and they're going to talk to their friends and family, and it's going to cascade from that. And this is not going to be some kind of coastal elite thing. This is going to be an it works for everybody thing. So I'm very hopeful about that. I think, just to come back to what I was saying a minute ago about my experience at the White House, I think if we really focus on that, meaning how we deliver people something that's a little bit better, the politics are going to get better too, because it's not partisan. It's not like I have a red state water heater and you have a blue state water heater. It's just that we have like better heat pumps. So I feel like in a sense, the common sense of it is going to be the thing that carries us.
It's really well said. Owen, anything to add?
Exactly like Ari said, the better we can pitch climate change to be, incremental improvements of people's lives, the better we're all going to have making a real impact. The less it'll be politicized.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Ari, I'm sorry we didn't get to more about some of your private business ventures, but we'll have to have you back on the show. How do we find you? How do we get the guests to find you and what your organizations are working on?
Yeah, please come to rewiringamerica.org. You can check out our calculator for the IRA, and in a matter of weeks, we'll launch our first personal electrification planning tool online, which will help you take your house and figure out what you can do to electrify the first thing all the way to the last thing. Come visit us, come join our community, and we look forward to being on the journey with everyone.
Thank you everyone for joining. You can find us on most of the social media platforms at Join Raven. So that's Join, and Raven is with a Y, Rayven. You can find this podcast and more great content at joinraven.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to fight the climate crisis?